Thank you guys so much. And thank you, all of you, for joining us here this morning. Those of you who are joining online, I'm sorry if you tried the first hour. We're still not 100% sure what went wrong, but we're working on that, and I think it's working this time. We're going to assume it is and carry on. This morning, we wrap up a series called The Other Bible Stories. They're kind of obscure stories. Many of you have studied the Bible a lot and knew every single one of these, but they're not the ones you lead with, especially not like in children's Sunday school classes and things like that, because there's some dark stuff in them. There's some disturbing stuff in them, but they're important. And they have a lot to say to us in times, especially times that are disturbing, times like now. And right now isn't, let me just comfort you guys for a second, right now isn't quite as unique as we think it is. You look back through history, people have always been panicking. They're always at war with each other. There's always disagreements about which people should be running the government, and always. It just happens to be where we are. But at times like this, some of these even most obscure stories have a lot to tell us about what's always true, what's always real. So we're going to go there this morning. Real quick, got to lay a quick foundation. Again, maybe some of you know the Bible way better than I ever will. I just want to make sure that everybody in the room has some crucial information, and the rest of the story will make more sense. From the time of Moses on through the time of Jesus, there was a system of worship that the Israelites had that was built first around a tabernacle, then around the temple. The tabernacle was a portable worship center. The tabernacle was one that was fixed in one spot. But both of them had the same format. Both of them were full of symbols that pointed all the way back to Eden, that pointed to Jesus in ways the Israelites never imagined, but as people later figured out. They even pointed toward heaven in the future. It was a rich, amazing, intricate system of worship, and we just don't have time to dig super deep into that today. But that was a given from the time of Moses. Even through the darkest times of the days of the judges, there was always a few people still keeping some fires lit, some candles burning, making some sacrifices. This was still somewhere still in Israel. In the middle of it, not necessarily the very center, but in the most central, most holy spot was what they called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And in this little room was a thing called the Ark of the Covenant. How many have ever seen the Ark of the Covenant before? Okay, so some Indiana Jones fans. Good job. Seriously, though, this was an incredibly important box. It was made out of wood covered in gold, and it had all these symbols all over it and these cool carvings of angels on top. And inside was the 10 Commandments and several other things that represented the covenant that God had made with his people. And what this box really represented was that when they were building their camp around it, they were building their camp around God himself. When the priests and the Levites were carrying it very carefully, they weren't allowed to touch it. They certainly weren't allowed to look into it. That penalty of death, very clearly laid out in the scriptures up to that point. But when they were carrying it into the Jordan River, their feet touched the waters part. Why? Not because the box was magic, but because they were following God himself. They were obeying his instructions and doing it exactly his way. When they marched around the walls of Jericho, the box was out in front and the people are carrying it. And they won that battle, not because the box was magic, but because they were doing what God had told them to do, the way that he told them to do it. But they forgot all of this during this era, during this time where they would reject God and they'd follow idols, and God would let them get conquered, and then they'd get saved by somebody when they finally called out to God for help, and then they'd come back around and then it'd all start over. They forgot what it was really about. The last line of the book of Judges sums it up very well. It says this: in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And that word we translate as king, it doesn't necessarily mean king literally the way we think of king. It means ultimate authority. There was no one person completely in control. It could be king, dictator, prime minister, anything. There's nobody that everybody answered to. And this included God. Everyone did as they saw fit. So why was it so chaotic? Because that's exactly what happens anytime when we all do whatever all of us see fit at the same time. It's going to be chaos. It's going to be anarchy every single time. So almost at the end of this cycle, almost at the end of this particular era, you see a man who has 2 wives, and they go to worship at the tabernacle. One of his wives had never had children. She prays to God, if you'll give me a son, I will bring him back here when he's old enough, and he will grow up here and serve you here in your tabernacle. Her name was Hannah. His name was Samuel. And for some reason, God chose to answer that prayer. We looked at this last week. God is not obligated to follow deals that we make up for him. Okay? That he can if he wants to. Sometimes he does. But he's not obligated to. But she kept her vow to God when he did what she asked, and she brought her son, and he grew up there in the tabernacle, or nearby, and served in the tabernacle. And at the end of chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, we read this: the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And again, keep in mind, when it says his word this early in what we now call the Bible, they don't have the whole thing yet. It's still being written. They had what they called the book of the law, which was the first 5 books. They had the original versions of Joshua and Judges, which are just barely being finished at this point. But Samuel can't look through 1st and 2nd Samuel and go, what am I supposed to do tomorrow? Oh, it's happening in real time, okay? And they can't look forward, and they can't see a lot of the stuff. They certainly can't see the New Testament. So what is this word that God is speaking to? Well, certainly whatever scripture they already had up to this point, but he's also speaking directly to him. That's why they call him a prophet. Samuel was able to hear from this young age, actually hear the voice of God and communicate those messages to others. And so 1 Samuel 4:1, and Samuel's word came to all Israel. Now in the original, there's no punctuation. In Hebrew language, it's kind of confusing, but they didn't have all the periods and quotation marks and stuff. So there's no marking for this, but there's clear in the story, there's a big pause between here and the next phrase. Samuel's word came to all Israel means this is how things were. Day after day, if anybody cared at all about what God was doing, which wasn't very many people, but if anybody did, they would come to Samuel and they would hear from God from Samuel. This is how things were. And then one day, things changed. So, you ready? This is the actual story we're going to marinate in today. Now, the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. Notice this was not a message from God. Samuel did not tell them to do this. They weren't crying out to God for help and God responds by sending somebody. They just decided today would be a good day to go fight the Philistines. And 4,000 people died. 4,000 Israelites died. Verse 3, when the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I've done the same thing they just did right there. Anybody else? Have you ever done something and you were like, you just assumed it was God's will? It has to be God's will. How could it not be God's will? But then it goes wrong and you go, man, why did God do this to me? Anybody besides me? I'm raising both hands. I've done this a lot. It's a dangerous thing to do. Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. They have it exactly backwards. The only reason that ark worked was because it represented that God had an idea, and no matter how outlandish it sounded, they were willing to put their lives on the line to follow it. Marching behind the Ark of the Covenant meant they were doing their best to go where God himself was leading them. But here they're going, let's get the magic box. Then God has to obey our wishes. Then God has to give us victory over our enemies. It just doesn't work that way, brothers and sisters. It just never does. So 3 words. I'd love for you to say these out loud with me because I really want them to stick. Never challenge God. If you're writing things down, just write down that word challenge. Because here's the thing. God is incredibly loving and merciful and forgiving. And thank God, literally thank him that he is, or we'd all be completely stuck, right? But that's not the same thing as challenging God, as saying, hey, see what you're going to do now. That's a totally different thing. Him being merciful, and it's not that he allows himself to be mocked. And if you ever think you're going to beat God at anything, you're not. You're just not. Neither am I. He's God. We're not. Believers tend to make a really big mistake often. And then we say, hey, you know what? If God hasn't struck me dead, I think he must be okay with this. I know it says it's a sin in the Bible, but maybe he's okay. Surely it's got to be okay. He's a loving God. He's a forgiving God, right? It's okay. Or we make the opposite thing. We go, hey, I know this is the right thing to do. I know this is exactly, I can actually show you verses in the Bible that this is something I should be doing. It's okay. God will forgive me if I don't. We dare not challenge God. It's never going to turn out well. We must not assume that God is on our side. There's no way to force him to be on our side. Our job, all of us, whatever perspectives we are coming from, is to try to figure out, are we on his side? Seek him, seek his will, and then try to follow it as best as we can. If Samuel and the rest of the people in this story could have looked forward to Proverbs, which had not been written yet, they could have seen a passage we've looked at almost every week for the last several weeks, which says this: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This is the exact opposite of the idea of everyone does what they see fit. This is God is the ultimate king, and we do our best at all times. Whether we get it right, whether we get it wrong, all of us who claim to follow him need to be trying to figure out, are we doing what he wants? Am I on his side? Are we tracking so far? This is why things were so chaotic, as they were going the opposite way. Again, they didn't have the whole Bible like we do, so they couldn't read even further forward, where Paul writes this to the Galatians: do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let's go back into the story. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. When the Ark of the Lord's Covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Now, throughout the Old Testament especially, a couple places in the New Testament, you'll see that God will cause an earthquake. Is this God right here? No. The ground's shaking because there's a lot of angry people yelling. Has absolutely nothing to do with God whatsoever. And these 2 guys, Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli the priest, it's documented in the first 3 chapters, they were absolutely evil people. They were lighting the candles and making the sacrifices and sort of going through the motions, and also doing some really despicable things in the face of God, challenging God on a daily basis, how they were living their lives and how they conducted themselves inside and outside of that tabernacle. They were straight up evil guys. But they're okay with this here, and they're going, hey, God's going to follow us. He has to, because we got the box. Let's go. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has ever happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." Do you notice anything strange about how they retell the story of Israel in Egypt? They got some crucial details wrong. They're talking about the gods of Israel delivering them. They're talking about the plagues that happened in the wilderness. The plagues happened in Egypt. That's how God, singular, delivered them. Well, how could they get it that wrong? Well, because God's people weren't telling them the truth. It only makes sense if people get wrong unless we go back to the source. Does anybody here remember the song "We Are the World" back in the day? Okay, the line, I love the basic idea there where artists got together and did something good for hungry people. That's a good idea. But one line in the middle really bothered me. Is where Willie Nelson sang this line. "As God has shown us by turning stone to bread, so we all must lend a helping hand." Didn't Jesus not turn stone to bread? Yeah, he got it totally backwards. Jesus wants us to feed the world, but he didn't turn a stone to bread. You get the idea. They can't tell the story because God's people hadn't told them the story. God's people weren't living the story. Of course they got it wrong. Of course they thought it was a lot of gods and got the details weird. But back into the story, here's what happened. They go into battle against the Philistines, and this time 30,000 die. 40,000 the first time. This time Israel loses 30,000. And by the end of the day, Hophni and Phinehas and their dad Eli had also died. And in the middle of all that chaos, Phinehas' wife goes into labor and dies in childbirth and names her son before she actually passes on. This is all we know about her. We don't know if she was somehow a godly woman despite him being so evil, but man, did she nail it here. And that's why it's included in the biblical story. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Now that name Ichabod is still around. It's kind of rare. The only Ichabod I could think of off the top of my head when I was getting ready for this was Ichabod Crane from the Headless Horseman. There's probably some other ones out there, and I just should know them, but I don't. But it's a name that exists. But what's important here is this, that the name is actually almost exactly a Hebrew word, Ichabod, which is translated most of the time throughout the scripture as either glory or honor. But just like a lot of other words that we sometimes say a lot but don't really understand, like, for example, hallelujah. We just say it in another language and just say it. Glory and honor, ichabod, what it really means is revealing the essence of something, revealing the true power, glory, whatever of something or someone. So when it comes to God, what's actually going on here is not just somebody sees a light or a vision or something, but they are getting a glimpse of God's true nature. They're seeing just how good he really is, how powerful he really is, how untouchable he really is, how wise he really is. When God reveals his glory, he's showing us himself. We get a vision of him, his essence, in a deeper way. And what she is saying here is, we have lost what makes us the people of God. And it's not that box. It's God himself. We have lost God. We have lost the essence of God. We've missed the whole point. See, to have any kind of a relationship with God that's actually real or actually works or make any kind of sense, it's got to start with fearing God. Everybody, if you would, again, try and say these two words with me. Fear God. And just to clarify, I want to make sure this is clear. We're not talking about running scared, Godzilla, not that kind of fear. We're not talking about the fight or flight. We're talking about a healthy respect. If you've got some medicine or some cleaning chemicals at your house and you keep those way up high or under lock and key because you know you need them, but you also are aware that they could be dangerous, you get the idea of this kind of fear. Anybody who knows how to shoot guns and does that on a regular basis, you know what I'm talking about. In fact, any of you that are here today, I guarantee you don't just call them guns, you call them firearms. Am I correct? And you're careful and you don't let anybody touch them without going through the speech. You hold it away from you. Here's the safety. Make sure it's unloaded. This whole thing. I barely have spent much of my life doing that, but I've heard that speech many times and had a good time shooting the firearms. Because people who do that on a regular basis, they respect it. They get it. They know how fun it could be and how dangerous it could be. Everybody else either panics, oh no, a gun. Or they go, bang, bang, and play with it. But a healthy relationship with a firearm has fear, a healthy kind of fear. Does this make sense? And this is where our relationship with God has to start. In fact, in Proverbs, it says this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Well, the Israelites had forgotten that completely. Meanwhile, the Philistines had their own God. We know his name was Dagon. Scholars debate on what he looked like. We have no visual versions from history of the grain god concept, but a lot of people think he was some sort of a grain god. A lot of people also think he was a fish god. This is actually an image that we see a lot in archaeology, and a lot of people think that that is Dagon. Either way, just to clarify, the Hebrew word dag means fish, and the Hebrew word dagan means grain. And so that's why there's these two schools of thought. Either way, as you'll see in this story, what the important parts of the story, it fits either way. If they could ever prove someday he was kind of a merman, or they could prove somehow he wasn't, it's not going to change the story at all. So just settle in. Sorry, I'm a history nerd. I can't help myself sometimes. We move on. 1 Samuel 5, verses 1 and 2. After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. That's their capital. And they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. But the following morning when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and his hands had been broken off, and they were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. He's destroyed. He's humiliated. Symbolically, if you don't have a head, you can't talk, you can't see, you can't speak, you can't hear. If you don't have arms, you can't do anything. I realize there's some people out there in the world that can do quite a bit with no arms, but you get the metaphor, right? God is making it very clear, I am way bigger than Dagon. I'm obliterating him. Maybe that's where the phrase, I'll be dagoned, come from. I'm just kidding. That's not where that comes from. And it's not wrong to take an idol's name in vain, just the real God. Anyway, sorry. Dagon is lying prone. It's the same verb actually as what we talk about when we say worship a lot of times. It's like he's bowing down to God, this idol. He's totally helpless because it's a broken statue. It's not real, and that's the whole point. The story continues. That is why to this day, neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. Of course, this was when it was written then. If you go there now, you can't see it. This is a really ancient document. So it doesn't mean the Bible doesn't know what's going on in the Holy Land today. It means it's a really old book that we still have. The Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation on them and afflicted them with tumors. And now we come to a really interesting thing about the Bible. As we translate it, there are certain words that sometimes get translated a little more politely than they were in the original. And it's not that we're trying to change anything. It's just we want to be able to read it in church and read it to kids and all this kind of stuff. For example, here's an example. When Saul gets really mad at Jonathan at one point, because Jonathan is sticking up for David instead of him. Almost every English translation says, and Saul rose to his feet and screamed, "You son of a loose and immoral woman." Yeah, you can guess what he probably actually said. But we don't want to use that colloquialism in church, and so we say what it meant. And there's actually several ways that this happened in several directions. In Hebrew, they call this concept ketiv keri, and it means there's a written word and what's meant to be publicly read. The most common one that in a good direction is this. Because they feared God in their best moments, they refused to say his name out loud. They just abbreviated it, YHWH. They took all the vowels out so nobody'd know for sure how to say it. They would not say Yahweh like we just casually do. They would say, if they spelled it out, it'd sound like Yahweh in Hebrew. They didn't. That's how their verbs would sound. But when they come to that verse, they trained everybody who's reading aloud to say, instead of that, they'd say Adonai, which means the Lord. And so they're seeing this on page, and everybody understands we're saying the name of God, but what we're hearing is the Lord, the one who's in control, the king, the guy in charge. Okay? That's ketiv keri. Well, this is one of those places in the Bible, because what it says is tumors, and tumors are kind of gross, but that word, what it really means is a swelling. It can even mean a hill or a mountain or a mound that people build up to look, have like a lookout or something. But what it most likely means, and almost all scholars agree that happens here, is it means hemorrhoids. What happened is God afflicted the people of Ashdod with rats everywhere and really bad hemorrhoids. I'm just going to say it out loud in church. I'm sorry. That's what. Isn't that weird? That's crazy. So they think they're all miserable and helpless, and they say, "Get this thing out of here." They send it to another town. They all get better. Same thing happens in that town. They go, "Whoa, we don't want this either." They send it to another town, and they panic, and they go, "No," and it all just keeps going. And so they, like the Israelites, are making it up as they go. They're doing whatever they say fit. And here's their crazy idea. They say, okay, let's get 2 cows that have just had babies. Anybody knows anything about cows? If they just have babies, all they're going to do is go to that baby. We're going to tie those cows, yoke them to a new cart, a brand new cart, and we're going to put the Ark of the Covenant on it, and we're going to just follow them and see if they take it back home. They've never been to Israel. Let's see if God can guide these random cows. Again, God's not obligated to do this, but he chooses to. But they also said, hey, and you know what? We should give God some gifts. What would he like? I know. Let's make some little gold rats and some little gold hemorrhoids. I didn't notice there's no picture, okay? There aren't any, and I don't want to try and find any. I don't want to search the internet to try and figure out what that might look like. So I'm just throwing this out. This is what's on this cart, is the Ark of the Covenant and 5 gold rats and 5 gold tumors, whatever that is. Okay, so they just follow these cows, and guess what? They go right back to where they're supposed to go. They take the ark back to Israel, and the Israelites get really excited. They're like, all right, here we go. And they open the lid to see if everything's inside. What do you think's going to happen? They die. And here's the crazy part. 70 people did that. I don't know about y'all, but after about the 3rd or 4th person, I'm not lifting the lid. Okay? Just saying. But 70 people die, and now they kind of panic and just leave it alone for quite some time. Here's the problem. It's easy to look back and we can be judgmental or laugh or whatever. But this is what happens to all of us when we decide that instead of making God our ultimate authority and seeing his rules as guardrails that protect us along the path he's lined out for us, instead of fences to keep us in or barricades to keep other people out. It's neither of those things. He says, follow me. Follow my voice. Go my way. Do the things I've created you to do. This is it. The guardrails are there to keep us on track. And whenever we ignore all of that, we ignore the guardrails, we ignore the path, we ignore his voice, we make up crazy stuff just like they do. It's going to be chaos every time. And God is pretty clear about some of the things that are timeless, the things that he always wants done. Here's a couple of examples, and then we're going to wrap up today with one last big idea. Micah 6:8 says this, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. 1 Peter 2:17 says, show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. That word emperor, it's often translated king. It just means ruler. It could be emperor, king, prime minister, whatever. So what Peter is telling us is our go-to posture as believers should be this. We respect everybody. We show respect to everybody. Believers, non-believers, put people in any box you see other people putting them in. Don't. But we show respect to everybody. That's the first thing. Then we love the family of believers. The people that have chosen to follow God with us, we get closer to them every step we get closer to God himself. We fear God, exactly like we just talked about it. And we honor the emperor. Notice we don't worship the leader. We don't bow down to them. We don't fear them. What God wants us to do is to honor the king. Would you say that with me and kind of emphasize that middle word? If you're writing it down, you're writing down the word the and put it in all caps. We're talking about Jesus here. Honor the king. In Romans 13 and several other passages, we're told as believers that our go-to posture should be to respect those in authority. And throughout the scriptures, you see people doing that as much as they possibly can. That's the go-to. And then you see moments where it says the authority says this and God says this. The godly people choose God. Every time. And that's how we should be as well. Psalm 2 is a psalm that actually looks forward. It's a prophetic psalm. It's about the Messiah. And in this, it contains a warning to kings or leaders around the world, people in authority. It says this, therefore, you kings, be wise and be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss the Son, or he will be angry. I bet they never had any idea what that meant back in the Old Testament days, but they figured it out after Jesus came and the Messiah showed up. Kiss the Son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. And the good news at the end of all this craziness is this. Somehow, once the ark got taken back to Israel, and then very carefully and respectfully taken back to where the tabernacle was, and worship was reinstated under Samuel's leadership, somehow or another, at the end of this cycle that just went on and on and on and on, they finally repented. At least for a season, under Samuel's leadership, they actually really worship God. And Samuel laid it out. This is what that's going to look like. And I think this is where we need to wrap up today. Samuel said to the Israelites, if you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of all the foreign gods and Ashtaroths and commit yourselves to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Brothers and sisters, this is the thing. If there's anything in our lives today, we probably don't have a statue of a guy that looks like a half man, half fish that we pray to. But if there's anything in our lives that we spend more time, more emotion, more thought, more money, more whatever else on than we do with God, maybe it's an innocent thing, maybe it's a fun hobby, but we should be a little suspicious. I wonder, is that a God to me, or is that just something I do for fun? And if there is anything, anybody, any political party, any club you're in, any relationship, any job, whatever it is that's requiring you to choose between something you know that God said and something that you have to go with to still stay part of that team, that relationship, you got to choose God. We dare not challenge God. We dare not fear God. We've got to follow the King. Abraham Lincoln said this. We looked at this several weeks ago. It's the final quote of the day. What I love about this is his posture of humility. He says, I know that the Lord is always on the side of the right, but it is my constant anxiety and prayer that I and this nation be on the Lord's side. And that's what I hope that you're hearing God say to you, what I am hearing God saying to me today. What's important is not that we somehow convince everybody else that our way is the best way and then get God to bless that. What's important is that you and I and all of us together keep trying to figure out what actually is God's will and follow that to the best of our ability. That's the only hope we have of unity. It's the only hope we have of making the world a better place. The government of America or any other government of the world is not going to fix things. They're just going to cause more chaos, just like we do as individuals and as groups, however we do that. When we make it up ourselves, we're always going to get it wrong. But if we all collectively say, hey, you know what does God want in this? And we do our best to follow that, we've got a chance. You've got to reject the other gods, recommit to the one true God. As usual, we're going to stand, we're going to sing, we're going to wrap this up with a chance for you to make a vocal commitment as you sing, or if you need to make a public decision, or you just like to talk or pray about it, I'll be right there. But I hope that every single one of us today will choose to either commit or recommit to Jesus. Let him be your one ultimate authority.